democracy. So he will highlight on that precisely, and then he will also react on the issues of ethnicity with the relation to the Ethiopia. So the floor is yours again, Eric.
Oh, great. Well, Dr. Freeman is no stranger to Watch Democracy Grow. I believe he has been a presenter so many times, and he continues to be involved and engaged. And Dr. Freeman, he has been involved in Africa for 30 years. He's a researcher, writer, consultant, and speaker on a variety of topics concerning Africa. He provides unique economic, political, and analysis of the African continent with a focus on development, hundreds of articles and reports on policy. And Professor Freeman has visited more than 25, the continent more than 25 times. He's an instructor at Catonsville Community College of Baltimore County, Frederick Community College, and Osho Lifelong Learning Institute, where he teaches several courses on African history. He writes a lot on his blog. You may visit it. It's called Lawrence Freeman Africa, theworld.com. Without no further ado, let me invite my good friend, Dr. Freeman. Welcome, sir. Welcome on another edition of Watch Democracy Grow.
As usual, it's always a pleasure to be with everybody here for our discussion this afternoon. Would you like me to begin now, Eric?
Yes, please. Yes,
okay.
please.
Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, just checking everybody can hear me. I think that one title we may use for our discussion today is Sovereignty and Economic Development. From my standpoint, and I've given some more extensive lectures over the last few weeks, to eliminate the unacceptable living conditions of African nations, we need politically and economically sovereign nations, nations that act in the interest of the people, with the participation of the people, and promote the kind of economic development that will enable the citizens to have the material standard of living so they can participate in a true democracy. The population of each African nation should be united as citizens of a single cohesive nation state, a nation whose government and citizens together are motivated to implement policies today that will ensure a prosperous future for tomorrow's generations. To accomplish this, we should be committed to two principles. One, the nation's commitment to a better future for tomorrow than today is the shared common interest of all its people, which supersedes so-called ethno-nationalism. Two, this shared vision of the nation's future should be to eliminate poverty and hunger and economic suffering. And this requires that we create industrialized nations throughout Africa, which necessitates massive infrastructure development. Now, there are many people, well-meaning, who don't believe that African nations can become industrialized economies. They believe that they will remain agricultural based for decades into the future. That, I do not share that point of view. I think that without an industrialized nation, without manufacturing agricultural sectors that are functioning and prosperous, you will not be able to meet the requirements for the standard of living that the population requires, not just today, but we're expecting an increase, almost doubling of the population of the African continent over the next approximately 25, 30 years. One of the key ingredients to transforming African economies, which most people have no or very little understanding of, and not just in Africa, but among my fellow American citizens as well, is they do not understand the role of credit. And we will discuss this a little bit because this is a project that Henrietta and I have been involved in now for a few years. African economies have been suppressed by the absence of adequate vital categories of infrastructure. The only way to fund the necessary infrastructure, we're talking about energy, which there's a paucity of energy throughout the continent. We're talking about railroads, we're talking about roads, we're talking about schools, we're talking about hospitals. This categories of hard and soft infrastructure the lack of that, the dearth of that, is what's killing Africa and preventing African economies from truly developing. My discussions over many years and increasingly recently have been that without an understanding of credit and the application of credit, we will not be able to solve that problem, the problem of inadequacy of infrastructure and the lack of industrialized nations. As a physical economist, which is what I call myself, as opposed to a monetarist, that is, I am concerned about the physical progress of the economy as it relates to the increasing standard of living of people, as opposed to a monetarist who's merely concerned with monetary values, how much money you may make one day or 1 year or 1 hour on the stock market is of no interest to me whatsoever. But as a physical economist, I understand the role of credit, not money. And credit is essential to transform undeveloped African nations into successful industrialized economies. To this end, Henrietta and I, along with others, have been working now for a substantial period of time to create an Africa Infrastructure Development Bank, which would be a credit bank to fund the desperately needed infrastructure and fund the infrastructure for nations, regions, and transcontinental infrastructure projects. This is a work in progress that the two of us have been committed to. Now, to understand the role of credit, I will start with identify for you one of my heroes in the United States, Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Treasury Secretary under George Washington when Washington became president in 1789. And he established the first national bank, that's what it was called, which was actually a credit bank. And through the application of Hamilton's understanding of economics, real economics, I would call it, he was able to transform 13 agrarian colonies, which were relatively backward in the sense of production of wealth. And he transformed these agrarian economies into a powerful economic nation known as the United States of America. Recently, it's become less economically powerful, but it was a creation really of Hamilton, not Adam Smith. It was not based on free trade. It was based on an understanding of bringing a manufacturing society sectors to the colonies, which again was also opposed. It was opposed by the slave states, by the slaveocracy, by the states' rights people like Jefferson, and Hamilton won the argument. And as a result, we were not forced to buy all our manufactured goods from England and other places around the world. And we protected and nurtured and fostered a manufacturing sector, which, as probably everybody on this call knows today, doesn't really exist in Africa. That is, we don't have a vibrant manufacturing sector anywhere in Africa. We have a small portion of it in South Africa. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. Now, another one of my heroes is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he applied Hamilton's principles. He was a student of Hamilton, even though he's born in 1882, a couple of hundred years after Hamilton's works. And he was also his great grandfather, Isaac Roosevelt, was a collaborator of Alexander Hamilton. There's a long history there we'll skip for today, but what Roosevelt did is he applied Hamilton's credit policies, and he understood them enough to apply them and brought people around him who understood these policies. And as a result, Roosevelt succeeded in lifting the United States population out of the Great Depression, which was very severe for the majority of Americans at that time. He was able to lift people out of depression, and he was able to build the economic machine that succeeded in defeating the Nazis in World War II. So how do you do this? Well, although President Hoover in 1932 created an institution called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC. Hoover's RFC was basically creating money to lend to the big banks, to bail them out and provide them with liquidity. But they weren't building the economy. So it was a failed operation designed to just bail out the major financial institutions. Roosevelt, although he came from an upper class family, was a man of the people. And he also was, I would call him, a fanatical follower of the principle of the general welfare, that government exists for the benefit of the general welfare of its people. And all his actions were guided by how to promote the general welfare of the population. Roosevelt becomes president, takes office in March of 1933. In those days, it was March as opposed to January today. And he alters the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And by doing so, he moves it away from simply providing money, liquidity to the big banks, who weren't lending it to the economy. And he made the RFC a direct government intervention into the economy. And it became the largest credit facility that the world had ever seen up until that time, for the 12 years that President Roosevelt was in office. And it also was the single most important institution he created. He did many things, as people familiar with American history. His first 100 days, he set up all kinds of organizations to help people put them to work, to help farmers, rural electricity, etc. But none of these would have worked without the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which did directly end the Depression, and it also directly funded the war effort. So it was extremely successful. And as a result, we were able to move the country in a direction that most people didn't think was actually possible. Now, the RFC started with a small capital base, and this is something that Henrietta and I have been discussing for this African Reconstruction Bank, is how do you fund credit? Because credit is a form of debt. And the question, if it's appropriately applied, it produces a return of value for your economy and for your citizens. But as the case with Hamilton, who also used debt to create the First National Bank, this was also true with the RFC, that the RFC floated bonds, which is debt, to create a base of capital. It originally was $500 million. And this base of $500 million became the basis for the credit that was lent by the RFC. Now, over the 12 years of the RFC, as its disbursements increased, so did its capital base. But it was not inflationary, and it never lost any money. So it was a highly successful operation. So I want to say a few things about the RFC and then move on to a discussion that is also important for Africans to understand, as well as Americans, the Bretton Woods system. But essentially, the RFC, I mean, Roosevelt creates, as I said, the largest institution of lending that the world has ever seen. And it was profitable. It built up the US economy, and it was non-inflationary. The leader of the RFC was a fellow named Jesse Jones, who was a businessman from Texas, and Democrat. They were both Democrats, and he understood the same principles that Roosevelt did. And as the head of the RFC, Jones was extremely effective. I mean, both Jones and the FDR knew that the key to reversing the Depression was to get credit into the economy. Credit to help business, credit to help people alleviate the suffering of their personal economies. And together they both acted on the principle of the general welfare and the common good, not just the United States, but actually for the world. And Jones was constantly fighting with the banks because the banks would not lend money, which is actually the kind of situation we've been in since 2008, when we bailed out the banks and they wouldn't lend money back into the economy. And Jones tells bankers, quote, "If the bankers fail to grasp the opportunity and to meet this responsibility, there can be one alternative: government lending. The question, therefore, fellows, is will our banking be continued in private hands or of necessity be supplemented by the government? The answer is up to you. No one must be allowed to suffer for a lack of food, clothing, or shelter, or for a lack of credit for agriculture, business, or industry. Banking should be conducted in a spirit of productive public service, not purely for profit." And this was a continual problem that Jones and Roosevelt had to deal with, is the banks didn't care about the economy. Now, the argument that many people make is, quote, "the government should not be involved in the economy." This is a false argument. In fact, throughout the history of known history of the last several hundred years of economies, all economies that prosper have government intervention, not communism or socialism, but intervention in the sense of doing those things that the private sector cannot do, that advance the productive powers of the economy for the benefit and the common good of people. And Roosevelt and Jones understood was credit, public credit. And again, this is something that is not understood by the United States or the West in terms of Africa today. The Chinese do have some understanding of it. Some of the nations in Africa have an understanding of this concept, some do not. But there is a proper role for the government to play in the nurturing and developing of an economy for the general welfare of the people. And credit is one of the most essential things that a government can do. It's called public credit, or otherwise public debt, but debt for a positive purpose. So this is one of the issues that went on throughout the whole Roosevelt period, but it's gone on for a long time in terms of discussion of economics. Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat, which he was famous for, going on the radio on May 26, 1940, about what was necessary to win the war. Now, this is 1940, so it is before we officially entered the war, which would be after Pearl Harbor in December 41. But everybody knew, and Roosevelt knew, as early as 1936, we were going to go to war. So we had no industry, we had no army, we had no airplane plants, we had nothing. And yet we were going to go to war. Very much like Kennedy's speech in 1961 when he said we're going to go to the moon. And we had none of the components to take us to the moon. We didn't have the chemicals, we didn't have the metal industry, we didn't have anything. So Roosevelt says to the nation in 1940, "I know that private business cannot be expected to make all the capital investment required for the expansion of plants and factories and personnel, which this program calls for. Therefore, the government of the United States stands ready to advance the necessary money to help provide the enlargement of factories, the establishment of new plants, and the employment of thousands of necessary workers, the development of new sources of supply of raw materials, and the development of mass transportation." All of this, Roosevelt is telling the American people in 1940 that the government will provide. And this was left up to, of course, Jones, the head of the RFC. So just in summary, we don't know exactly how much money was dispersed from 1933 to 45, first for the civilian economy and then for the war economy. But to give you some rough estimates, this is the amount of credit that was generated by the RFC. Prior to the war, about $13 billion was lent to the US economy through the RFC and paid back through the profits of the investment. The war period, which is much shorter, 41 to 45, approximately $20 to $24 billion was invested in the war effort to build up the machine, which became known as the arsenal of democracy. So if you add the two together, you're talking about somewhere around $35 billion of credit through the RFC to accomplish two fundamental historical tasks: the ending of the Depression and the defeat of the Nazi powers. And I want to shift slightly now, because of time constraints, to discussion of what was Roosevelt's long-term global policy. We just took a brief look at his domestic policy and the use of credit, but he had the same outlook for the rest of the world. In the early 1930s, Roosevelt developed a good neighbor policy, which is he wanted to develop a development bank for South and Central America, an international international bank of the Americas, a development bank of the Americas for helping Brazil, Argentina, and other nations. The bank was never brought into existence because of opposition, but the concept of the good neighbor policy was very well known. Some of you may also know that in January of 1941, Roosevelt outlines the 4 freedoms for the world, which are applied to the rest of the world, not just the United States. The most important being the freedom of want, that we are required to supply the needs of the people. Again, the common good. And you may also be familiar that Roosevelt forced Churchill to sign an agreement called the Atlantic Charter in August of 1941, which again put forth a very broad program that after the war, colonialism would end and independent nations would be able to participate in using their resources for their own development. And he had many, many fights with Churchill. They're all recorded in a book by his son, As He Knew It. And Roosevelt was constantly real knockdown, drag out arguments that the empire had to end. All empires had to end, including the British Empire. So Roosevelt had a grand design for the end of the war. While he was trying to win the war, he was actually had a design for what the world should look like at the end, when the military victory would occur, which everyone was sort of confident on by 1943-44. And his grand design included the Bretton Woods system. And this is what Roosevelt was intent on doing. And again, it's not on, I understand the reasons why, but people today dislike the Bretton Woods system. I dislike the Bretton Woods system because it became something different than what Roosevelt had intended. So on July 1st, 1944, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a Bretton Woods conference was opened. And there was both Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, was there. But the main point man for Roosevelt was a fellow by the name of Harry Dexter White, the Assistant Secretary of Treasury. And he carried out Roosevelt's policies during this conference. And again, most people are familiar with Bretton Woods on the negative side, and most people know about the International Monetary Fund. But the most important aspect of the Bretton Woods system was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD. It was a reconstruction and development bank, not controlling, quote, the macroeconomics of a country, but lending money, just like the RFC. Now, this has now become known as the bank, or most people refer to it as the World Bank. And this idea of the IBRD was put forth by Harry Dexter White, quote, to assist in the reconstruction and development of territories of members by facilitating the investment of capital for productive purposes, including the restoration of economies destroyed or disrupted by the war, and the reconversion of productive facilities for new peacetime needs, and emphasis, the encouragement and development of the productive facilities and resources of less developed nations. Roosevelt and Harry Dexter White were both very keen that the purpose of the development bank was to promote the productive powers of the population to improve and increase the wealth of their economies. In Harry Dexter White's draft of 1942, this is prior to the conference, which is in 44, he writes that the bank has the explicit provisions of the Reconstruction Bank was a provision for long-term capital for desirable productive projects that serve directly or indirectly to permanently raise the standard of living of the borrowing countries. Roosevelt and White wanted a banking facility to, quote, supply a huge volume of capital that would be needed for relief, reconstruction, and economic development, essential for the attainment of world prosperity and higher standards of living. Interest on such loans could not be excessive, and loans could not be for the purpose of repaying old loans. In other words, if you see now the similarity to the ROC, this bank, the IRBD, was going to be a development bank lending long-term, low-interest credit for the development of nations. There was a lot of back and forth. We don't have time to go through it at this point, but I will tell you that there were many underdeveloped countries that were represented there. And most interesting to me was Ethiopia, because it was not a colony, was actually a participant, along with Egypt and other countries around the developing sector, at this discussion. And the Ethiopians were very pro-Roosevelt and pro-development. And there were a lot of positive things, interesting historical developments that took place between the Ethiopians and Roosevelt that we don't have the time to go through at this point. But just to bring people to a conclusion on this question, at the heart of Roosevelt's proposals for the Reconstruction Bank was his understanding, along with many of his advisors, that private financial investment was insufficient. So the private sector then, and I believe now, and I believe intelligent people in the private sector know this as well, the private sector cannot fund the needs of developing nations, especially infrastructure, in the way it's being conducted. They understood that the private sector was insufficient for Asia, Africa, Polynesia, South America, etc. That these countries needed help to develop their own industrial capability. That these undeveloped nations needed billions and billions of dollars of investment. Roosevelt and his advisors understood that increasing the standard of living of people living in the undeveloped nations would actually benefit the entire world. It will lead to an increase in trade among nations. A constantly rising standard of living would stimulate an increase of exports and imports throughout the global economy. Roosevelt understood that an infusion of credit was necessary for these nations and had to support state-led development. He knew from his experience in the New Deal in the United States that to pull the nation out of the Depression, credit had to be lent into the economy. And of course, one of the greatest examples of this is the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, Roosevelt delivers a message to the Congress on February 12th, 1945. So this is after the completion of Bretton Woods. He's delivering a message to the Congress to encourage the House and the Senate to support this new institution, the Bretton Woods, which had not existed. Interesting, this is exactly 2 months before he dies. He dies on April 12th. He never sees the Bretton Woods, just like he never sees the creation of the United Nations, which was also his idea. But he's saying to the Congress explicitly and to the American people implicitly, quote, as we dedicate our total task to the winning of this war, we must never lose sight of the fact that victory is not an only end in itself, but in a large sense, victory offers us the means of achieving the goal of lasting peace and a better way of life. These proposals for the International Fund and International Bank are concrete evidence that economic objectives of the United States agree with those of the United Nations. They illustrate the unity of purpose and interest in the economic field. What we need and what they need correspond: expanding production, employment, exchange, and consumption. In other words, more goods produced, more jobs, more trade, and a higher standard of living for all. To the people of the United States, this means peacetime employment for those who will be returning from the war and for those who are involved in wartime work. It also means orders and profits to our industrial and fair prices to our farmers. We will need prosperous markets in the world to ensure our own prosperity, and we shall need the goods of the world to sell to us. The main job, restoration, is not one of relief. It is one of reconstruction, which much largely done by the people and their government. It is at this point that a highly developed economy of the United States can play a role in helping the rest of the world. Now, unfortunately, as I said, Roosevelt dies 2 months later. And almost from the time he dies, the Bretton Woods system is already being perverted. Even though he still had people there, they were being pushed out of office. Truman is brought in. Truman has none of the views that Roosevelt had. He has a very limited view of the world. He made some major mistakes in how he conducted the policy after Roosevelt. Therefore, Roosevelt's grand design was sound Hamiltonian economic policy. If we help other nations develop their industry, they become markets for the US. They become consumption markets of capital goods. And this principle still holds true today. And I know many people have a very negative view of China's Belt and Road, and also the BRICS. I don't. They are actually doing things that would be in complete agreement with Roosevelt. If we build up African economies through long-term investments in infrastructure, and we raise their standard of living, we are increasing global trade. We are increasing global markets. Resources don't do anyone any good under the ground. They have to be productively used for the development of an economy. Unfortunately, after the death of Roosevelt, most of the West was involved in extracting resources from Africa, mainly hydrocarbons, not building anything. Now there's an opportunity where something is being built, in many cases, infrastructure. The United States should be doing that. The United States has had no orientation to this since John F. Kennedy was president. That's 1960 to 63. So that's almost 60 years ago. He understood this as well. He was a follower of Roosevelt. He worked with Kwame Nkrumah to build the Volta Dam project, which provided energy and also produced aluminum from bauxite. Nothing like that has been done in 60 years. We've had various discussions and new programs created, Prosper Africa, the Millennium Challenge Account. None of them address the fundamental need of infrastructure. And now what I would like to see is the United States change that policy. The United States is proposing an African summit in December. Why don't we, the United States, make a capital investment into the African Infrastructure Development Bank that would then be used as a capital base to build the credit, to fund the credit that is needed for infrastructure across the African continent. That's what I would like to see happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman. I see that you invoked the spirit, at least the ideas of the late President Hamilton. As you know, he was a Caribbean man. And
Correct.
So being the Caribbean, that there was a certain freedom of thought when he also was a sailor and did a lot of things with those types of guys. They like to see results, and they like to see results right away. I was so energized by the idea of industrialization for the continent because you know it's needed. And I think basically that would fuel so much growth and development. But I would like for you to just take just 2 more minutes as we prepare for our next speaker to tease out the idea, I think, that first came out of Harvard, where we talked more about industrialization from a clustering standpoint, where you would have different centers of excellence. And so since we already have different regional entities within the continent, because as you know, if we just have industrialization, you have most countries, they have the copycat effect. So we may have industrialization, but it may not tend to a smart growth. So what type of a strategic approach would you take with industrialization? A cluster effect where you have centers of excellence where this region say they're going to do this. What would you say in short?
I think that
if you were speaking to African leaders now.
I think that we could have a combination. I think there are areas in Africa where we're already seeing a certain specialization. For example, I've been doing some work and traveling to Cote d'Ivoire. In Cote d'Ivoire, they have the biggest port in West Africa, in Abidjan. If they revitalize and refurbish and rebuild and expand their railroad, they become a major industrial driver to the whole area, which includes the Sahel, which is very underdeveloped, and also countries that have now recently carried out various coups. A lot of the problems that we see in West Africa and in other parts of Africa is a population that is underdeveloped and forced to live in abject poverty and suffering is very easy to manipulate through extremist terrorist activities. So I think you could see certain areas of the world. I think that Ethiopia can play a major role if we get past this point in terms of industrial development. They already put together a transportation capability with the railroad from Addis Ababa to Djibouti. Kenya is already playing a role in terms of medical facilities, probably some of the best exist in East Africa. But other countries still need a basic manufacturing sector of goods so they don't have to import. When you're forced to import everything that's necessary, you then are no longer sovereign. And that's my point. You're subject to outside forces. So there is a minimal level of manufacturing capability and agriculture. Like take Cote d'Ivoire again. They produce 2 million tons of cocoa, but they don't process it. It goes all to Europe, and then they buy the candy bars when they come back. Same thing with cashew nuts. So there's all kinds of ways that manufacturing can bring added value to these rich resources. And still, I could see a value in certain kinds of specialization.
Indeed, indeed. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Always thought-provoking for sure, Dr. Freeman. And I know there are many of you out there who may have questions for Dr. Freeman. Check out his blog. And I think we're hoping that there'll be opportunities where we can get some questions from out there. So thank you so very much, and really appreciate your presentation. Now,